In the heart of the Ozark Mountains of northern Arkansas, there existed a road that stretched like a thin scar across the dense wilderness, winding through valleys, ridges, and forested hills that seemed to close in on travelers from all sides. The road itself was little more than a beaten path, carved by wagons and horse hoofs over years of persistent travel. Its dirt and gravel surface uneven and treacherous after every storm. Rainwater pooled in its ruts, and snow in the winter transformed it into a slippery, gray ribbon of ice and mud. For anyone unfamiliar with the area, a single wrong turn could lead to hours of wandering through dense undergrowth, where visibility was limited and the eerie sound of the wind through the trees seemed almost like whispers carrying unseen threats. Yet, for as dangerous as the road might have appeared at first glance, it was not the landscape that instilled the deepest fear in those who knew of it. Travelers, whether they were merchants carrying goods, farmers on errands, or wandering wanderers, seeking employment in towns farther south or west, would eventually learn that the true danger was hidden, subtle, and impossible to anticipate until it was far too late. Stories began slowly at first, in hushed tones around fires and in the dim corners of local taverns and inns. A man would arrive in town, weary from a long ride through the Ozarks, only to report that someone he had met on the road had disappeared without a trace. At first, such accounts were met with skepticism. The wilderness was unpredictable. Animals attacked without warning, rivers swelled and claimed lives, and accidents were common enough to account for some disappearances. But then, patterns began to emerge, patterns that could not be explained by misfortune alone. Travelers who were experienced, cautious, and armed were vanishing just as easily as the naive or the unlucky. Entire families waited for husbands or sons who never arrived, and goods sent ahead with couriers would appear in town weeks later, sold for pennies by strangers who insisted they had stumbled upon abandoned belongings. The sheer number of unexplained absences began to unsettle the residents of the area, a creeping sense of dread that something unnatural, something deliberate, was unfolding in the shadows along that narrow, winding road. Between the years 1887 and 1894, at least 11 men were confirmed to have disappeared along this stretch between Jasper and Harrison, a distance of roughly 30 miles, yet so isolated that even the most determined search parties could spend days without finding any trace of a person. The horses these men rode, often the most reliable and valuable assets they possessed, were discovered wandering alone, seemingly untethered to any human presence. The reins would drag across the dirt or tangle in the roots of the ancient trees, lining the road as if the rider had simply evaporated into thin air. Saddlebags filled with personal items, papers, sometimes goods intended for trade would surface in local towns days or even weeks later, sold cheaply by strangers who swore they had stumbled upon them abandoned on the roadside. These small, scattered clues became a pattern of terror, each one a breadcrumb leading into a nightmare. People began to whisper of the road that swallowed men whole, a road that seemed to have a mind and a hunger of its own. Even though no one could point to a single logical reason for such a series of vanishings, the families of the disappeared were left in a state of perpetual limbo, their lives suspended between hope and despair. A mother would wake each morning, glancing at the horizon for the familiar figure of a returning son, only to be met with silence. A wife would polish the furniture, hoping that when the door creaked open, her husband would finally walk through it. Letters would be sent with detailed instructions, with pleas for news, but answers never came. Some assumed that misfortune or injury had overtaken their loved ones and that they might still be alive, trapped somewhere in the wilderness, unable to find their way back. Others, more pragmatic and hardened by the realities of frontier life, began to accept the inevitable that the men they loved were gone, consumed by an unknown force or circumstance. Grief hardened in these families like clay baking in the sun, a persistent ache that refused to soften over time. Hope dwindled gradually, quietly, until what remained was a numb, almost mechanical endurance of daily life, punctuated by the sharp pangs of remembrance when an empty chair at the dinner table or a horse returned without its rider served as a reminder of their loss. Local law enforcement, limited as it was in both manpower and resources, found itself ill-equipped to investigate the disappearances. The Ozark Mountains were vast, rugged, and poorly mapped. Deputies patrolled long stretches of road with little support and even less knowledge of the terrain. Searching for one missing person could consume days of time, only to end in frustration when the person was not found. Searching for multiple missing men over a span of years was nearly impossible, especially when the disappearances were spread out across a network of isolated paths and trails. Many officers were forced to rely on witness accounts, which were often inconsistent or contradictory. And even the most dedicated investigators were hampered by the primitive communication methods of the time. Telegraph lines were sparse, and written correspondence was slow and unreliable. News traveled at the speed of the nearest horse, leaving weeks or months for evidence to vanish completely before a proper search could even be organized. This structural inability to respond effectively to the disappearances created an environment in which fear and speculation could flourish unchecked. Rumors, of course, spread faster than facts ever could. Tales of kidnappers, wild animals, or hidden caves became intertwined with the reality of the missing men, creating a haze of superstition that made the road even more terrifying. Locals spoke of strange sightings in the twilight hours, of shadows moving among the trees where none should exist, of sudden cries echoing through the hills when no one could possibly be near. Merchants, traders, and itinerant workers would warn newcomers to stay on well-trodden paths, to travel in pairs or groups, to avoid the road altogether if possible. Children grew up hearing stories of men swallowed by the mountains, of horses returning alone, of mysterious strangers with strange eyes who could lure travelers off the path with nothing more than a plea for help. These stories, whispered and amplified by fear, became a kind of folklore, cementing the road's reputation as a place where the ordinary rules of safety no longer applied. Yet, despite the growing fear, the disappearances continued. Each new incident reinforced the terror, and each missing man became part of an unspoken, dark record of the road. Travelers were cautious, yes, but necessity often compelled them to venture into danger. The Ozark Mountains were a harsh place, and commerce, travel, and survival demanded risk. Merchants needed to move goods. Farmers needed to sell produce. Workers needed to reach towns where employment could be found. And so, with trepidation, they traveled the road, praying that they would be the exception rather than the rule. And, tragically, some were not exceptions at all. They would disappear, leaving the same trail of horses, abandoned belongings, and unanswered questions behind them. Fear became tangible, almost a physical presence on the road, pressing down on shoulders and whispering warnings that few could ignore but even fewer fully understood. In time, the road's reputation became inseparable from the disappearances themselves. People began to talk about it not merely as a path between two towns, but as a place where life itself seemed fragile, where the very act of travel carried with it the possibility of vanishing entirely. And yet, for all the talk, for all the superstition, no one could pinpoint a single reason. No one could identify a cause. There were no bodies, no confrontations, no witnesses to the final moments. It was as though the victims had simply ceased to exist, evaporating into the mist that often rolled down the mountain slopes in the early morning, leaving only the sound of wind through the trees and the low whinny of horses who had lost their riders. This unnerving pattern, repeating over years, transformed the road from a place of commerce and necessity into a symbol of mystery and dread. A place that tested the nerves and courage of anyone who dared traverse it. What no one understood it. The time was that the danger was not the wilderness. It was not the mountains, the cold nights, or the isolation. The true danger waited patiently beside the road, hidden in plain sight. It was a house, a modest cabin, a quiet family, a pregnant woman crying out for help, and behind all of it, a system of murder so refined and so normalized that killing became no more remarkable than eating supper. To understand how something this horrific could exist for so long, you must first understand the world in which it occurred. The Ozarks of the late 19th century were harsh and unforgiving. Towns were small, scattered, and separated by miles of forest and rocky hills. Dirt roads twisted through the landscape, often becoming impassable after rain. Law enforcement was limited, underfunded, and stretched thin across enormous distances. Travel was slow and dangerous, and most journeys were made alone. People carried everything they owned with them: money, tools, food, sometimes even livestock. If someone disappeared, there were no missing person posters, no organized searches, no national attention. The assumption was simple and cruel. The land had taken them. This belief allowed disappearances to blend into the background of frontier life, creating the perfect environment for predators to operate without consequence. Elijah Hickman did not arrive in the Ozarks as a killer. He arrived as a broken man. Born in Missouri in 1829, he spent most of his life as a struggling farmer. Droughts ruined crops. Debt accumulated year after year. By the mid-1880s, everything collapsed. His land was seized to pay debts he could never repay. His wife died during a bitter winter, leaving him alone and hollow. Those who knew him later said that winter changed him permanently. The warmth left his voice. His patience vanished. What remained was resentment. In 1887, Elijah left Missouri and moved south into Arkansas. He built a small cabin along the Jasper to Harrison Road, choosing the location carefully. It was isolated, enough to avoid scrutiny but close enough to attract travelers seeking shelter. Living with him were his daughter, Sarah Hickman, a withdrawn young woman known for her silence, his nephew Levi Jacobs, a volatile man with a violent temper, and Levi's wife, Marjorie, a deeply religious woman whose faith bordered on obsession. At first, the cabin was simply a home. The family struggled. Food was scarce. Money was almost non-existent. Then one evening in September of 1887, opportunity arrived. A traveling merchant stopped at the cabin asking for water and a place to rest. Hospitality was a rule of survival on the frontier. Turning someone away could mean condemning them to death. Elijah welcomed the man inside. Coffee was poured. Supper was shared. The traveler relaxed, believing he was safe. By morning, the traveler was gone. His horse remained tied outside. His belongings were untouched. Days later, Levi was seen selling the horse in town. No one questioned it. Disappearances were common, and no one wanted to imagine something darker. Inside the Hickman cabin, however, everything had changed. A line had been crossed, and once crossed, it became easier to cross again. The family realized something terrifying. They could kill, and no one would come looking. There were no witnesses, no neighbors close enough to hear screams, no patrols along the road. Death could be hidden, and profit could be extracted from it. What began as a single act of desperation evolved into a calculated system. Marjorie's pregnancy became the key to that system. When a lone traveler approached, Levy would shout for help, his voice filled with panic. Marjorie would cry out in pain, clutching her stomach, screaming that the baby was coming too early. The act was convincing because it was rooted in reality. No decent man walked away from a woman in labor. Travelers followed them inside without hesitation, believing they were doing the right thing. They were told water was needed from the cellar. The traveler was asked to go first. At the bottom of the stairs, Levi waited in silence. One heavy blow to the base of the skull ended everything instantly. There was no struggle, no warning. The body was dragged deeper underground, and the house returned to quiet routine. Sarah cleaned. She scrubbed blood from the floor until no stains remained. She washed clothing until her hands cracked and bled. She folded belongings neatly and stored them away. Later, she would insist she never killed anyone. But violence does not always require force. Sometimes, it only requires participation in silence. Behind the cabin, Elijah kept pigs. On frontier farms, pigs were common. They consumed scraps and waste. They also destroyed evidence. Bodies were fed to them slowly, methodically. Bones were buried shallowly in the soil. Blood vanished into the dirt. Over time, the family learned exactly how long it took for a human body to disappear completely. Murder became routine. One traveler every few months. Never too often. Never. Locales. Always men who traveled alone, men whose absence would not immediately trigger organized searches or newspaper headlines. The spacing was deliberate. Too many disappearances too quickly would draw attention. Too few would threaten survival. The killings were calibrated, reduced to logistics rather than impulse. Food, money, supplies, then disposal. Nothing emotional. Nothing personal. Just repetition. When Marjorie gave birth, the killings paused. The household shifted into a different rhythm. A fragile stillness settled over the cabin, not out of remorse, but out of necessity. Then, months later, Marjorie began to claim she was pregnant again. The lie was convincing. Her body language changed. Her posture softened. Her voice carried strain. The performance improved with repetition, and when the act was accepted without question, the deaths resumed. A child named Martin grew up in that house. He learned to crawl on wooden floors that creaked above a cellar soaked into the earth with violence. He learned to walk while muffled sounds echoed beneath him, sounds he was taught not to question. He played near the pigs that consumed what remained of men who had once spoken, laughed, and dreamed. For Martin, these sights and sounds did not register as wrong. They were background noise, routine, familiar. Violence was not shocking to him. It was part of the environment, as ordinary as chopping wood or feeding animals. When horror becomes routine, it stops feeling like horror. It becomes structure. It becomes home. Years passed, and the road developed a reputation that no one could fully explain, yet everyone seemed to feel. Travelers spoke of it quietly, usually after nightfall, when unease felt more honest. Some claimed their horses grew restless near the Hickman property, pulling at reins, refusing to move forward. Others described a sudden heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched without seeing eyes. These stories were dismissed as superstition, the kind of exaggeration common on dangerous frontiers. But fear does not emerge without reason. It accumulates slowly. It forms from patterns sensed long before they are understood. People noticed absence before they noticed evidence. Inside the cabin, life followed a strict rhythm that left no room for doubt. Meals were eaten in silence, not out of discipline, but because conversation was unnecessary. Everyone knew their role. Elijah justified everything as survival, repeating the same reasoning until it felt like truth. Levi grew more confident with each killing, his movements more assured, his decisions faster. What began as hesitation hardened into efficiency. Marjorie prayed constantly, her faith no longer a comfort but a framework through which she explained suffering as divine will. Sarah worked without visible emotion, washing clothes stained with blood as though they were no different from mud or grease. The cellar became a boundary not just between life and death, but between acknowledgement and denial. Suspicion did not arrive through investigation or pattern analysis. It arrived through memory. In 1894, farmer Jacob Moss recognized a horse Levi was riding. The animal belonged to a merchant named Samuel Hartwick, a man who had passed through months earlier and never reached his destination. Moss remembered the saddle, remembered the markings. Memory lingered where paperwork failed. Moss followed Levi home at a distance and reported what he had seen. Deputies arrived expecting nothing more than confusion or coincidence. They were not prepared for what the land itself would reveal. As deputies searched the property, a pig began digging near the edge of the yard, routing through softened earth. What surfaced was unmistakable. A human jawbone, gnawed and fractured. Silence followed. Then urgency. For days, the ground was turned over, shovels striking soil that had absorbed years of concealment. Shattered skulls emerged, chewed bones, teeth, buckles, buttons, fragments of personal belongings stripped of identity. 11 victims were counted. Some were identified through records and possessions. Others remained anonymous, reduced to remains. With no names, no families to notify, no stories to recover. Levi fled before he could be captured. Some said he vanished into the wilderness. Others believed he boarded a train and became someone else entirely. There were no confirmed sightings, no arrest, no grave. Elijah and Sarah were sentenced to death. Marjorie was declared mentally unfit and committed to an asylum, her mind fractured by years of denial, faith, and complicity. Martin disappeared into history, absorbed into the system, carrying memories no child should possess. The household that had functioned like a machine was dismantled, but its effects rippled outward long after. On the night before her execution, Sarah finally spoke in a way that unsettled even hardened officials. There was no confession filled with emotion, no apology. She said only, "I washed the clothes. That was my job." The words landed with more force than any scream could have. They revealed the truth at the center of the Hickman story. Not rage, not insanity, but routine. The normalization of violence through repetition and division of labor. Everyone did their part. No one questioned the whole. The Hickman family did not kill out of passion or revenge. They killed because it worked, because it sustained them, because no one stopped them. 11 lives were erased quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. Men entered their world as travelers and exited as resources. What makes this story terrifying is not the brutality itself, but how ordinary it became. How easily murder blended into daily life when wrapped in necessity and silence. Because monsters do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like a family offering shelter. Sometimes they look like help.